So this is story hour for you today. I'm going to read the text. It's not going to be on the screen, so you can pretend like you are the people of old who couldn't read anyway, most of them, and you'll get to hear the story maybe as they did. And then we'll just see what there is for us here. I think there's a lot. Oh, quick shout out to I recognize Karen Kinney in the early service because this is also her last day as a steward until we appoint her in a year or so. So anyway, thank you, Karen, for your good work. Very good. And can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me in back okay? Is it too loud? Not too loud. Okay. That's because I got these two geniuses helping with the audio visual stuff. So thank you to Ted and Julio for your good work today. It's a lot. So here is the story. The Philistines assembled their troops for war in Judah. The Philistines took positions on one hill while Israel took positions on the opposite hill. There was a valley between them. Now, if you've read the Older Testament at all, you know that this is a battle that kept going back and forth year after year for a very long time. The Israelites and the Philistines. Anybody want to hazard a guess where the Philistine region of ancient Israel was on our understanding of Israel today? Gaza. What you're seeing today is a 3,000 plus year old war that just goes back and forth, back and forth. These are deep roots, different people, different characters, but there's been a problem in that neck of the woods for as long as that's been a neck in the woods. So here we have a story of one of those battles. A champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistines' camp. He was more than 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore bronze scale armor weighing 125 pounds. He had bronze plates on his shins and a bronze scimitar, I guess that's right how you say that, hung on his back. His spear shaft was as strong as the bar on a weaver's loom, and its iron head weighed 15 pounds. His shield bearer, he had a shield bearer, that's a curious thing, walked in front of him. So how many of you remember Andre the Giant? Just huge mountain of a guy. How many of you are baseball fans? How many of you watched the Giants take on the Yankees a few weeks ago? Losing miserably, 3 games in a row. How many of you saw Aaron Judge at the plate? That guy is a mountain. All right, so if you don't know Andre the Giant, think Aaron Judge, just this huge hulk of a guy, even bigger than Aaron Judge, 9 feet tall as the story goes. He stopped Goliath and shouted to the Israelite troops, "Why have you come and taken up battle formations? I am the Philistine champion, and you are Saul's servants. Isn't that right? Select one of your men and let him come down against me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we will become your slaves. But if I overcome him and kill him, then you will become our slaves and you will serve us. I insult Israel's troops today." As if he needed to say that last part. But he's insulting them to their face and even telling them that he's doing it. The Philistine continued, "Give me an opponent and we will fight." When Saul and all Israel heard what the Philistine said, they were distressed and terrified. Well, David heard that his brothers were with Saul and all the Israelite troops fighting the Philistines in the Elah Valley. So David got up early in the morning, left someone in charge of the flock, and loaded up and left, just as his father Jesse had instructed him. He reached the camp right when the army was taking up their battle formations and shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines took up their battle formations opposite each other. David left his things with an attendant and ran to the front line. When he arrived, he asked how his brothers were doing. Right when David was speaking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came forward from the Philistine ranks and said the same things he had said before. David listened. "Don't let anyone lose courage because of this Philistine," David told Saul. I, your servant, will go out and fight him." "You can't go out and fight this Philistine," Saul answered David. "You're still a boy, but he's been a warrior since he was a boy." "Listen, your servant has kept his father's sheep," David replied to Saul. "And if ever a lion or a bear came and carried off one of the flock, I would go after it, strike it, and rescue the animal from its mouth. If it turned on me, I would grab it at its jaw, strike it, and kill it. Your servant has fought both lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them because he has insulted the army of the living God. The Lord, David added, who rescued me from the power of both lions and bears, will rescue me from the power of this Philistine. Go, King Saul replied to David, and may the Lord be with you. Now, what's King Saul thinking here? King Saul's thinking, one, this kid's going to die here in about 5 minutes. And two, maybe that will rally the courage of his troops. Kind of like the manager in a baseball game getting thrown out. Then the team comes alive and comes back to win. Unless it's the Giants this year, then we all kind of sulk back to the dugout. But anyway, I digress. So he says, go do it. Then Saul dressed David in his own gear, putting a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David strapped his sword on over the armor, but he couldn't walk around well because he'd never tried it before. I can't walk in this, David told Saul, because I've never tried it before. So he took him off. He then grabbed his staff and chose 5 smooth stones from the stream bed. He put them in the pocket of his shepherd's bag and with sling in hand went out to the Philistine. The Philistine got closer and closer to David, and his shield bearer was in front of him. When the Philistine looked over David, he sneered at David because he was just a boy, reddish brown and good looking. For some reason, we needed that last detail there. Not only was he an idiot, but he was also a good-looking idiot about to take on this Philistine. The Philistine asked David, am I some sort of dog that you come at me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said to David, and I'll feed your flesh to the wild birds and the wild animals. But David told this Philistine, you're coming against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel's army, the one you've insulted. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will feed your dead body and the dead bodies of the entire Philistine camp to the wild birds and the wild animals. This guy can talk some smack. Then the whole world will know that there is a God on Israel's side. And all those gathered here will know that the Lord doesn't save by means of the sword and spear. The Lord owns this war, and he will hand all of you, over to us. The Philistine got up and moved closer to attack David, and David ran quickly to the front line to face him. David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone. He slung it and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone penetrated his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. And everybody say, huzzah! Okay. So that's story number 1. Happened about 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Now we go to Jesus' time. This is after Jesus has done significant ministry. Later that day, when evening came, Jesus said to them, his disciples, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. They left the crowd and took him in the boat just as he was. Other boats followed along. Gale-force winds arose, and waves crashed against the boat, so that the boat was swamped. But Jesus was in the rear of the boat, sleeping on a pillow. They woke him up and said, Teacher, don't you care that we're drowning? And he got up and gave orders to the wind, and he said to the lake, Silence, be still. The wind settled down, and there was a great calm. Jesus asked them, Why are you frightened? Don't you have faith yet? Overcome with awe, they said to each other, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So did any of you see a story, a headline this past week? I think it actually showed up in several media sources. But there was an ancient manuscript found in Egypt, one of the oldest pieces of Christian antiquity. And it was a little piece of paper describing an event of Jesus' childhood. Anybody catch that? It was kind of an interesting thing. It was a story about Jesus as a little boy playing with clay pigeons, not the kind you shoot with a shotgun, but the little clay pigeons, and then decided to turn them into real pigeons. And so he did whatever he did, and all of a sudden these clay pigeons come to life and fly away. Well, a lot of people read that, and they're like, wow, that's amazing. That really happened. And when I read that, I'd already heard this story. Long before the manuscript was found, because if you read that article, you know that actually shows up in what's called the Gospel of Matthew. There are a lot of other Gospels that didn't make it into what we call our Bible. They didn't make the canon. The canon means the measure. And the reason they didn't measure up, or they weren't in the canon, was because of stories like this, some other theology that didn't quite fit how they thought They needed to portray Christianity and other things. There are some other boyhood accounts like him slaying a dragon in the sea and stuff like that, and some of the other gospels that show up. And this is a reminder to us that when we read stuff from antiquity, we need to take it with their vision in mind and not ours. So we live in the Western world where we are hyper literal. We live in a country where the Protestant Reformation did a massive amount of work and instructed us that the Bible is infallible and cannot be wrong. It's inerrant. In other words, the Bible's perfect, and what you read in it is exactly what happened. That's a problem. It's a problem for a couple reasons. Problem number one is Jesus never would have signed off on that statement, and neither would the Apostle Paul, even though it's the Apostle Paul's words that are quoted to make that argument in the first place. It's really, really something. We got to remember that when these writers put these things down, they didn't give a rip that somebody 3,000 years later or so was going to read this stuff. They wrote from their sensibilities, from and wanted to say what they wanted to portray in their remembered experience. So when we read stories like this, if you have doubts about this, you're like, I don't know about this David and Goliath story. I mean, it's kind of plausible. I'll give you one way to think about it that makes it kind of plausible in a minute. Um, it's okay if you have doubts about that. And if you hear about the story of Jesus calming the sea and all that, that's okay. Don't get hung up on the literalness of the text, because even if we were absolutely certain that it was literally, factually, historically true, what are we going to do with that? We're going to ask ourselves, how is this meaningful in our lives? We're going to go to metaphor. To quote Thomas or Marcus Borg, we're going to choose to look for more than the literal meaning of the story, because that's always where we go anyway. So there's room here for all of you. If you are absolutely certain this is exactly what happened, fine, that's great. Let's talk about the meaning of the story. And if you think the whole thing is just folk tale, that's fine. There's still something here that I think is worth looking. It made the canon for a reason. So we have two stories that are kind of similar. They're facing massive storms, giant storms. One's literally a giant, and the other one's literally a storm. So that's how we're playing with this today. And I think we can see some things in these stories that are actually helpful when we face our own giant storms. First thing we see in both instances is God is called upon. With the guys in the boat, they're freaking out, right? They've probably been praying a lot, and then finally they shake Jesus because maybe his prayers are going to get something done. And certainly, you know that these Israelites, as they're going into battle, going to face a literal giant, that they're praying that God is going to give them the victory. Have any of you ever, out of desperation, prayed before? Right. There are no atheists in the foxholes, as they say. And even if you're not a person who believes in God, I bet you've uttered a prayer when it really, really needed to happen, right? We can guarantee that's happening here. Now, what I want to say is I think it's a really good idea. I think when you're facing down giants, if you're in a storm or a little literal or metaphorical challenge right in front of you, I think prayer works. I think it works on levels that we don't even understand. At minimum, I think prayer works because it gets it out of your head. I mean, think about it. When you pray and you're telling God that you've got this diagnosis you're facing, or this job you want, or the Giants to win, or other important prayers, when you're praying something, are you saying something that God doesn't already know about? If we really believe that God is fully present and knows everything that can be known, God already knows. So the point of prayer is not to inform God of what's going on. The point of prayer is to get it out of your head and out of your heart. I would even go further. I would highly recommend that you put your prayer in writing. You know what that means? Journaling. Because when you actually start to write stuff out and verbalize with your pen and with your pen, this is what I'm struggling with. That alone is cathartic. It will open you up. It will unburden you to a significant level, and to think spiritually about this. I think when you actually put it out there, it unclutters your mind for a while. It tunes you in to what the Spirit of God might be showing you. Have any of you ever done this, by the way, where you're just fraught and you just start writing? And so let's start there. Anybody ever done that? Yep. Have any of you, as you've done that or after you've done that, had insight because you did that you didn't have before. That the journaling activity itself helped you get insight, right? I think God works with us in this process, gives us ideas, helps us see things that we didn't before. That is an act of prayer. And I highly recommend that if you're going through it right now, don't stop praying. Plus, we don't know exactly what our prayers affect, but the voice of wisdom from the beginning of the earliest chapter in the Bible throughout the end suggests that stuff happens. It may not always go the way we hope, but James, the brother of Jesus, is quoted as saying, "The prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective." At a minimum, when you pray, you are changed, and that may be enough. So pray. We saw prayer happening in both of these stories. The other thing we see has to do with wisdom. I think wisdom abounded, believe it or not, in both of these stories. First, with Jesus and the disciples, do you think they just sat there, with their fingers crossed and their legs crossed, watching all the water come in the boat and just decided to finally say something to Jesus? No, no. These are fishermen, right? So they know if there's water coming in the boat, what do they need to do? Get the water out of the boat, right? So they're doing everything they can. They're taking their tunics down and scooping it out that way. They're borrowing each other's beer steins and throwing the water overboard. Whatever was required to get this out. They're going to use conventional wisdom as much as they can. They didn't just think to themselves, "All I need to do is pray, and that's it." So there's a piece of wisdom here. It's like, if you know there are people who've been through stuff before, why don't you ask them, what did they do to get through the stuff? Because there's a lot of wisdom that abounds in community and with your friends. In the medical world, it's not, and this is going to maybe frustrate some other branches of the faith, it's not enough to pray. We have brains for a reason. So tap those brains, everything you can to figure out what you're dealing with, those giants in the storms, to figure out how you can navigate forward. I'll say that actually David used his own flavor of wisdom here. There's a book called David and Goliath by one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell. And he talks about this very scene as an entrance into his book, an introduction into his book that talked about unlikely success stories. And what he suggests, this makes the story somewhat plausible, if you will, is he said that in gigantism, and that phenomenon, that genetic thing that creates your Andre the Giants, one of the problems that people with gigantism have is terrible vision. They can't see far at all, which probably explains why this guy who's armored to the kilt, he still has an armor bearer in front of him. Why does he have that guy in front of him? Because he can't see past that guy. So he needs somebody to tell him where are things coming from so he can fight them off. David knows that he has no chance in hand-to-hand combat if we play along with Malcolm Gladwell's interpretation. He's got no chance in hand-to-hand combat with a giant. He's going to squish him like a bug. So what does he do? He asks himself, what do I do? What can I do? What am I experienced in doing that might actually work? He went for the air attack. Why would he be skilled with a sling and a rock? Because that's what shepherds do and did. Not right now, or maybe right now if this is really boring. YouTube search slingshots, ancient slingshots, or just slings, and you will see videos upon videos of not only how fast these shepherds, largely still from the Middle East, can sling a stone, but how accurate they can be. Remarkable. So, playing along with Gladwell's interpretation, while certainly God gave wisdom, and maybe God even gave a little extra oomph in David's arm, it's plausible that David from a distance could wing this stone good enough to literally take him out. It doesn't really take any of the incredibleness of the story out. After all, why do they give us this story? They're telling their readers, we want you to know that our King David, the eventual King David, was full of courage from the very beginning, and he was a warrior among warriors even as a child. They're wanting to build up this king in the memory of the people who he would serve, so that they would serve him well and remember him very well. That's their whole point. Why do we have the story about Jesus and the the giant storm and going under? Because the gospel writers want us to remember we're dealing with a very special person here in Jesus. So don't take that away from them. In both situations, you have courage, especially with David and Goliath. Uh, the disciples, not so much because they just wake up Jesus and Jesus does his thing and it's a truncated story. But David and Goliath, even though David felt confident in what he was doing and is talking smack about how strong God is, he still had to be the guy to go out and face Goliath. There's this great quote, if I can find it. Am I sitting on it? Yes, I am. This is a great quote. Brene Brown loves this quote. It's from Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "It's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. If this person fails, they at least fail while daring greatly, so that their place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Courage is required when we face storms of many kinds. And I have to tell you that you're going to face storms of many kinds if you aren't facing one right now. And while we can deny them and keep them at bay as long as possible, the storms tend to come anyway. And courage is required. There's there's no way around it. You got to go through it. And it's tough and it sucks, but it's the human experience. Sometimes it helps knowing that. Sometimes it also helps knowing that it's okay to be terrified, to shake in your boots. There's part of our Christian tradition, I've heard this over the years from different scenarios and situations, that somehow we've bought this lie that if we were full of faith, we would have no fear. There's even some scripture that talks about this. Perfect faith casts out all fear. So then when we're full of fear, we're like, I guess my faith's not so perfect, huh? And we're embarrassed about it. We don't want to let people know that we're terrified because what would that say about our faith? What would that say about God? I'm here to tell you, you're human. I'm here to tell you that Jesus, who's the one that we're claiming to follow, he was terrified the night that he was arrested. You remember that scene? He's praying his guts out. He's sweating drops of blood. He's so afraid of what's going to happen. Fear is a part of your life. Fear is a great gift you've been given to warn you that there are things that you need to be afraid of. But there come times for courage where we have to face into them. And some of you may have to do that sooner than later. Some of you may be able to hold things off for a while longer, maybe be in denial a little longer, maybe push that conversation off till later, maybe not go to the doctor for another 6 years or so, whatever the case may be. But the reality is, at one point or another, you got to face it. You got to do it. Well, you don't, because you could die. Because you could die and leave all the things that you need to do undone, which has its own kind of fear. We all face the fear. What are you doing to face the fear? I want to remind you that with David and with the disciples, they found that they were not as alone as sometimes they thought they were, that there was something else that was with them. And that takes me to a final thing that maybe is enough. Paul talks about a strange reality when we choose to turn to God, even in times of great fear. And he knew a lot about fear. Remember, this is a guy who was tortured, eventually martyred because he chose to follow this Jesus. Most of the disciples, that was their fate too. And speaking to the Philippian church, Paul instructs his people. This is the amplified version, so it gives you more annotation along the way. But Paul writes, he says, "Do not fret or have any anxiety about anything, but in every circumstance and in everything, by prayer and petition, with definite requests and with thanksgiving, continue to make your wants known to God." So Paul's an advocate of prayer. Pray your guts out when you're freaking out. And then he says this, and God's peace, and then he defines this as this, that tranquil state of a soul assured of its salvation or its wholeness through Christ, And so fearing nothing from God and being content with its earthly lot of whatever sort that is, that peace, which transcends all understanding, shall garrison and mount guard over your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. There is a peace that passes understanding that is available to us all the time. Just out of curiosity, have any of you, while facing your giant storms, have any of you ever experienced a peace that passes understanding? Yeah, it's a legit thing. And frankly, if that's all we had, if that's all the faith offered us, that might be enough because we're all going to face terrible storms in our life. Ultimately, we are all going to face our own mortality one way or another. And that is terrifying, no matter how full of faith you say you are. What a gift that there is a peace, even as we face that, that passes our understanding. In other words, we can't explain why we experience this peace, this deep shalom. And it's legit. Uh, becoming crosswalk, which is an ongoing process, has required courage of many of us to get to where we are now, to make the decisions to be as inclusive as we are over time, and to make that very proudly and boldly known has required some very significant battles with giant storms, if you will. Lynn and I can both attest to this, and so the case with many leaders in this church who fought and weathered that storm going through. That even when there were massive decisions on the line that cost a lot, there was still a peace that the God of Shalom, the God who loves all, was with us. And it doesn't make any sense. I remember Lynn telling me about one of her stories where it just felt like the wheels were coming off the bus at a different time in the church's history. And just everything in both of us were like terrified. And yet, when Lynn would do the kinds of things that we're talking about today, there was not much she could do to change the things that we were facing and having to deal with. But as she prayed, she experienced the peace that passes understanding. Somehow, that God was with her in this and through this. That's our privilege and our possibility at all times. I think the meditation, like Jenny led us in today, is a great way to help dial into that. Dave Carney Brown, who is kind of our resident expert on meditation here, he would say that tying in or tapping into that love of God is available at every single moment. I believe it. I believe it's why Jesus was able to, even as he's dying on the cross, he's remembered as looking at those who put him there and saying, having the capacity to say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. That only comes from a place of a transcendent peace. So I'm wondering what storms you're facing today. Because I bet you are, one way or another. And I'd like to pray with you and offer a way to pray even as you face down these storms. So we're going to pray in a second. I want to tell you what I'm going to ask you to do. As you breathe in, again, so it requires breathing. So you're breathing anyway, so you might as well do something with it. So as you breathe in, I'm going to invite you, especially as you consider your storm, to say more of you as a way of saying more of you, God. It's a way of saying help. I want more of what you're available, of what you have available in my life right now. And as you exhale, I want you to, and it's all silent stuff, I want you to say less of me. And I want to qualify that. Less of me, not because you're an awful person. That's not it. You are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God. You're remarkable. But at least for me, sometimes, 90% of the time, my ego gets in the way. Ego was once defined for me as edging God out. That's what I mean. Our own hubris, our own way of thinking, our own stuff, the things that get in the way of God that are not aligned with shalom. When we're saying less of me, that's what we're saying. I want to purge myself of all of that so that I can be more and fully open to what you want to do in my life in this moment. Trusting that God at every decision is there to point in the direction of, or directions that lead to greater and greater shalom, which has always been the plan of God. You with me? And then, Ted, if you want to bring up the next slide, we have a rendition of the Lord's Prayer, which about three of you can read on the screen. So I'll read it for you when we get there, and you can pray along with me. But first, let's pray this prayer together. So as you close your eyes, I just encourage you to continue to breathe and breathe deeply. And I want you to, in your mind's eye, to imagine the giant storm that you are facing or know that you will face. I want you to recognize it, try to name it, recognize its complexity, because they often are very complex. How it makes you feel, all the stuff that you can journal about later. Do a little work now. Understand the storm. Understand the giant. And with that giant storm at the forefront of your attention, pray as you inhale more of you. And as you exhale, less of me. More of you, less of me. One more time. More of you, less of me. God, remind us of this prayer as we walk forward to face our great fears that require great courage. With every step, may we continue to pray more of you, less of me. More of your wisdom, more of your insight, less of my fear, less of my blinders, less of my hard-headedness, less of my pride, less of my arrogance, less of my deafening doubt, more of you and your strength, more of you and your peace, more of you and your clarity, more of you and your unending ways toward shalom, more of you, God, less of me. To that end, we pray the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. This is an adaptation by John Cotter. It reads like this: Eternal Spirit, earth maker, pain bearer, life giver, source of all that is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God in whom is heaven. The hallowing of your name echoes through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the earth. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. And the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen. And a final word from the Apostle Paul as he wrote to the Roman church. I pray that God, the source of hope, will fill you completely with joy and peace because you trust in him. Then you will overflow with confident hope through the power of the Holy Spirit. Thanks for coming. Hope you have a great day. If any of you want to help with tables and chairs, we would absolutely welcome that. And we'll see you next week.